In the early morning darkness of October 31st, 1999, 217 people boarded an EgyptAir Boeing 767 at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. They were bound for Cairo, Egypt, a journey of more than 5,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. Some were elderly American tourists eager to see the pyramids. Others were Egyptian military officers returning home from training in the United States. A young first officer was counting the days until his wedding. None of them would reach their destination. 32 minutes after takeoff, at approximately 1:50 in the morning, EgyptAir Flight 990 plunged from the sky and slammed into the Atlantic Ocean 60 miles south of Nantucket Island, Massachusetts. In less than 2 minutes, what had been a routine overnight flight became one of the most controversial air disasters in aviation history. All 217 souls on board were killed. What happened in that cockpit during those final terrifying moments would spark an international dispute between the United States and Egypt that persists to this day. The American investigation concluded that a member of the flight crew deliberately crashed the aircraft. The Egyptian government vehemently rejected this finding, insisting mechanical failure was to blame. More than 2 decades later, the truth remains bitterly contested. This is the story of EgyptAir Flight 990. The Boeing 767 that would operate Flight 990 was registered as SU-GAP and named Thutmose III after the ancient Egyptian pharaoh who ruled nearly 3,500 years ago. The aircraft was 10 years old, delivered brand new to EgyptAir in September of 1989. It had accumulated over 33,000 flight hours and more than 7,500 takeoffs and landings. By all accounts, it was a well-maintained aircraft in good mechanical condition. The flight had originated in Los Angeles that evening, arriving at JFK just before midnight. After refueling and a crew change, Flight 990 was scheduled to depart for Cairo shortly after 1 in the morning, a journey expected to take approximately 10 hours. The passengers who boarded that night represented 7 different nations. 100 were American, 89 were Egyptian, 21 were Canadian, and the remaining 7 came from Germany, Sudan, Syria, and Zimbabwe. Among them was a diverse cross-section of humanity. There were newlyweds and elderly couples, doctors and journalists, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Babies and teenagers sat alongside senior citizens. Many of the American passengers were retired seniors embarking on what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. 54 of them were traveling with Grand Circle Travel, a Boston-based company that specialized in escorted tours for older adults. They had signed up for a 14-day adventure through Egypt with plans to cruise the Nile River and explore the wonders of ancient civilization. Another 30 Americans were part of an elder hostel educational program eager to learn about Egyptian history and culture. Among them were 4 close friends from Southern California: Sheila Jaffe, 63, Toby Seidman, 71, Beverly Grant, 81, and Judy Bowman, 57. The women had known each other for more than 20 years, playing cards together nearly every week, sharing tuna salad sandwiches and stories about their families. This trip to Egypt and Israel was just the latest in a series of adventures they had taken together. There was also Luc Daisy of Montreal, who had planned to celebrate his 53rd birthday among the pyramids. Just 2 days before the flight, he had spoken excitedly to a colleague about how much he was looking forward to the journey. Claude Masson, the deputy publisher of Montreal's La Presse newspaper, was aboard with his wife, Janine Bordeges. Both were 58 years old. Masson was a respected editorial writer who had worked late on the Friday night before his departure, leaving adhesive notes on his assistant's desk that simply said, "Merci." But the passengers that night included more than tourists. 33 Egyptian military officers were also aboard, returning home after training exercises in the United States. Among them were 2 brigadier generals, a colonel, a major, and 4 other Air Force officers. These men had been in America to work with defense contractors and participate in Pentagon-sponsored programs, part of the close military partnership that had developed between the 2 nations since Egypt signed the Camp David peace accords with Israel in 1978. The presence of so many high-ranking military personnel on a single commercial flight would later fuel speculation about sabotage and conspiracy theories, but investigators would ultimately find no evidence that the officers had been targeted. Because the flight from New York to Cairo was scheduled to last 10 hours, EgyptAir policy required 2 complete flight crews, each consisting of a captain and first officer. One crew would handle takeoff and the first several hours, while the relief crew would take over during the long overnight portion of the flight. The active crew consisted of Captain Ahmed El-Habashi, 57 years old, and First Officer Adel Anwar, 36. Captain Habashi was a veteran pilot who had been with EgyptAir for more than 36 years. He had accumulated over 14,000 flight hours, with more than 6,000 of those in the Boeing 767. He was the kind of experienced, steady hand that airlines value on long international routes. First Officer Anwar was a younger man with his whole life ahead of him. He had switched assignments with another pilot specifically, so he could return to Egypt in time for his wedding. The ceremony was just days away, and his bride was waiting for him in Cairo. The relief crew consisted of Captain Rauf Noor El-Din, 52, and First Officer Gamil Al-Batouti, 59. Also aboard was Captain Hatem Rushdie, EgyptAir's chief pilot for the Boeing 767 fleet. Rushdie was traveling as a passenger, but could assist if needed. Gamil Al-Batouti would become the central figure in the investigation that followed. He was born in Kafr al-Dabusi, a farming community in Egypt, into a socially prominent family. His father was a local mayor and landowner. Al-Batouti had served in the Egyptian Air Force, where he was trained as a pilot and later became a flight instructor. He joined EgyptAir in September of 1987. At the time of the crash, Al-Batouti was the most senior first officer flying the 767 at EgyptAir. He had accumulated over 12,500 flight hours, with more than 5,000 in the 767. The reason he had never been promoted to captain was simple. The exam for the airline transport pilot license was conducted in English, and Al-Batouti did not have sufficient English proficiency. After he turned 55, EgyptAir policy prevented further promotions anyway. According to his colleagues, Al-Batouti was content with his position. As the senior first officer, he could choose his preferred flight schedules, which helped him manage family responsibilities. His youngest daughter, just 10 years old, suffered from lupus and was receiving medical treatment in Los Angeles. EgyptAir employees had even contributed to help defray her medical expenses. Al-Batouti was just 3 months away from mandatory retirement. He had purchased a car tire earlier that day to bring back to his son and had spoken to his family before the flight about his plans for after he stopped flying. Flight 990 pushed back from Gate 24 at JFK at precisely 1 o'clock in the morning. The aircraft taxied to runway 22R and was cleared for takeoff at 1:19. Captain Habashi and First Officer Anwar were at the controls with the relief crew, presumably resting in the cabin. The takeoff and initial climb were completely routine. The Boeing 767 lifted into the night sky and headed eastward over the Atlantic Ocean. Air traffic controllers guided the flight through the busy New York airspace, issuing standard climb instructions. At 1:44 in the morning, the aircraft reached its assigned cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. Everything appeared normal. The weather was clear. The aircraft was performing flawlessly. More than 200 people settled in for the long overnight flight, some trying to sleep, others perhaps watching the in-flight entertainment or reading. Then, approximately 20 minutes after takeoff, something unusual happened. According to the cockpit voice recorder, at around 1:40 in the morning, Relief First Officer Gamil Al-Batouti entered the cockpit. Under normal procedures, the relief crew was supposed to take over much later in the flight, typically 4 to 5 hours after takeoff. But Al-Batouti told First Officer Anwar that he wanted to take over early. The voice recorder captured a brief exchange. Anwar initially protested, but Al-Batouti was insistent. Eventually, the younger man relented and vacated his seat. The sounds of an electric seat motor whirring and a seatbelt clicking indicated that Al-Batouti was settling into the first officer's position on the right side of the cockpit. At 1:47, Captain Habashi acknowledged a routine radio instruction from New York Air Traffic Control to change frequencies. It was the last communication from Flight 990. A few minutes later, Captain Habashi left the cockpit, presumably to use the lavatory. Al-Batouti was now alone at the controls. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and disputed for years to come. The cockpit voice recorder captured al-Batouti saying something that sounded like 3 syllables, though investigators were never able to determine exactly what it was. Then clearly and softly he spoke in Arabic, "Tawakkalt ala Allah." The phrase translates roughly as, "I rely on God," or "I put my trust in God." It is a common expression in Egyptian culture often used in daily life when asking for divine assistance with ordinary tasks. The meaning and significance of these words would become one of the most contentious aspects of the investigation. At 1:49 and 45 seconds, the autopilot disconnected. 4 seconds later, the throttle levers moved back to the idle position, cutting power to both engines. The Boeing 767 continued to sail forward on momentum, but without power. Then the massive elevators at the tail of the aircraft, the control surfaces that make the plane climb or descend, moved to a nose-down position. The aircraft's nose dropped and Flight 990 began to dive. Al-Batouti repeated his prayer again, "I rely on God." The dive was steep, approximately 40 degrees, and the aircraft accelerated rapidly as it plunged toward the ocean. Within seconds, the Boeing 767 was falling at a rate that caused near weightlessness inside the cabin. Passengers and objects began floating upward against the ceiling as gravity seemed to disappear. The altimeters spun like cartoon clocks. Warning alarms began to sound. The aircraft descended through 30,000 feet, then 25,000, the speed building toward the design limits of the airframe. Al-Batouti continued to repeat his prayer, his voice calm. "I rely on God." He said it again and again. Somehow, Captain Ahmed Habashi managed to fight his way back to the cockpit. The near-zero gravity conditions inside the plunging aircraft would have made movement extremely difficult, but the veteran pilot found his way through the chaos. He burst through the cockpit door and into a nightmare. The voice recorder captured his desperate questions. "What's happening? What's happening?" He called to Al-Batouti by name, demanding an explanation. "What's happening, Gamil?" Al-Batouti did not answer. He continued his prayer. "I rely on God." The aircraft had descended from 33,000 feet to approximately 16,400 feet in less than 40 seconds. The airspeed had increased to nearly Mach 0.86, approaching the speed of sound and far exceeding the maximum safe operating speed for a Boeing 767. Captain Habashi grabbed his control yoke on the left side of the cockpit and pulled back, trying to raise the nose and end the dive. But the flight data recorder revealed something extraordinary. The elevator surfaces were now in a split condition. The left elevator, controlled by Habashi's yoke, was commanding nose up. The right elevator, controlled by al-Batouti's yoke, was commanding nose down. The two pilots were fighting each other for control of the aircraft. Under this conflicting input, the aircraft's descent began to slow. The nose came up slightly, and the 767 began to climb again, regaining altitude from 16,000 feet back up toward 25,000 feet. The aircraft's heading changed dramatically from roughly 80 degrees to 140 degrees. But the struggle was not over. The voice recorder captured Captain Habashi asking, "What is this? What is this? Did you shut the engines?" The master caution alarm was sounding. Warning lights were flashing. Both engines had been shut down by moving the start levers from run to cutoff. Al-Batouti replied simply, "It's shut." Habashi's final recorded words were a desperate plea, "Pull with me, pull with me, pull with me." But the elevator surfaces remained split. The captain was pulling up while Al-Batouti continued to push down. Without engine power and with the conflicting control inputs, the aircraft entered a second dive. This time, there would be no recovery. The Boeing 767 plunged toward the Atlantic Ocean at an astonishing rate, more than 20,000 feet per minute. The airspeed increased toward Mach 0.9797% of the speed of sound. The structural stresses on the airframe became overwhelming. At some point during this final descent, the left engine separated from the wing. Other small pieces of the aircraft broke away as the forces exceeded design limits. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder stopped recording. At approximately 1:52 in the morning, just 32 minutes after takeoff, EgyptAir Flight 990 slammed into the Atlantic Ocean about 60 miles south of Nantucket Island. There were no survivors. The first indication that something was wrong came from air traffic controllers in New York. Flight 990 had simply vanished from their radar screens without warning, without a distress call, without any indication of trouble. Controllers tried repeatedly to contact the aircraft but received no response. As dawn broke over the Atlantic on that Halloween morning, the Coast Guard launched a massive search and rescue operation. Aircraft and cutters converged on the area where the flight had disappeared. The waters off Nantucket were already tragically familiar to investigators. In 1996, TWA Flight 800 had exploded over Long Island. In 1998, Swissair Flight 111 had crashed off the coast of Nova Scotia. Within hours, searchers began finding wreckage, aircraft seats, luggage, personal belongings, and human remains. The debris field was scattered across the ocean surface, telling investigators that the aircraft had broken apart before hitting the water. Oil slicks marked the area where the main wreckage had come to rest on the ocean floor, about 250 feet below the surface. At New York's JFK Airport, airline officials set up an information center for the families of passengers. They gathered at the Ramada Plaza Hotel, a facility that had served the same grim purpose after previous disasters, so often that it had earned the nickname Heartbreak Hotel. Red Cross workers and Muslim clerics tried to comfort the grieving relatives as they waited for news they already knew would be terrible. In Cairo, similar scenes unfolded at the airport where Flight 990 should have landed. Family members collapsed in grief. A man in his 60s cried out, "My son, my son." Sana Isa of Calgary had come to the Ramada to share the story of her brother-in-law, Heshem Farouk. He was a 31-year-old co-pilot with EgyptAir who had been returning home after bringing his wife to visit family in Canada. Farouk's wife refused to accept that he was gone. "She won't accept that he's gone," Isa said. "I know he's gone, but we need the body. We need it to make sure he is resting in peace." The U.S. Navy dispatched the salvage ship USS Grapple from its home port at Little Creek, Virginia. The ship was equipped with sophisticated underwater equipment, including a remotely operated vehicle called Deep Drone 3. The NOAA survey ship Whiting and the Navy Fleet ocean tug Mohawk also joined the recovery effort. The Coast Guard cutters Spencer Reliance Monomoy and several others worked the surface collecting wreckage and human remains. It was grim work. The small boats would recover pieces of the aircraft, carefully tagging and cataloging each item as potential evidence, and they would recover what remained of the passengers, treating each fragment with the dignity owed to the dead. Within days, the Deep Drone 3 located the most critical pieces of evidence: the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the so-called black boxes. These instruments, designed to survive even the most violent crashes, held the key to understanding what had happened to Flight 990. The flight data recorder was recovered on November 9th, the cockpit voice recorder on November 14th. Both were immediately packed in water to prevent corrosion and rushed to the National Transportation Safety Board headquarters in Washington for analysis. The investigation of Flight 990 was complicated from the beginning by questions of jurisdiction and international politics. Under international aviation agreements, the investigation of an aircraft crash in international waters falls to the country where the aircraft is registered. Flight 990 had crashed in international waters, meaning the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority technically had jurisdiction, but the Egyptian agency lacked the sophisticated resources and expertise of the American National Transportation Safety Board. At the Egyptian government's request, the NTSB agreed to lead the investigation. It was a decision that would strain relations between the two countries for years to come. The investigation was massive in scope. The NTSB worked alongside the FBI, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Coast Guard, the Department of Defense, NOAA, Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, and Egyptian officials. More than 70% of the aircraft was eventually recovered from the ocean floor. Engineers examined every piece of wreckage for signs of mechanical failure. Metallurgists analyzed metal fragments for evidence of fatigue or corrosion. Experts reviewed maintenance records, pilot training files, and the aircraft's service history. The flight data recorder provided a detailed picture of the aircraft's movements during its final minutes, altitude, airspeed, heading, engine performance, and control surface positions. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sounds and voices in the cockpit. And it was the voice recorder that would prove most controversial. The recording was clear enough. Al-Battuti's repeated prayers, Captain Habashi's desperate questions, the split elevator condition as the two men fought for control of the aircraft, the engines being shut down, Habashi's final plea to pull with him. To NTSB investigators, the evidence pointed in only one direction. There had been no mechanical failure. The aircraft systems had all been functioning normally until Al-Battuti disconnected the autopilot and began the dive. The split elevator condition could only occur if one pilot was commanding nose up while the other commanded nose down. The engines had been manually shut off. The conclusion seemed inescapable. Gamil Al-Battuti had deliberately crashed the aircraft. 2 weeks after the crash, the NTSB proposed declaring the incident a criminal act and handing the investigation over to the FBI. The Egyptian government was outraged. Omar Suleiman, the head of Egyptian intelligence, traveled to Washington to join the investigation personally. What followed was a years-long battle between two nations over the fate of one man's reputation and, by extension, the reputation of an entire country. The Egyptian government and EgyptAir refused to accept that one of their pilots could have deliberately killed 216 innocent people. They demanded that investigators consider every possible mechanical failure scenario. They hired American aviation experts to challenge the NTSB's methods and conclusions. They launched their own parallel investigation. The phrase "Tawakkalt ala Allah" became a focal point of the dispute. American investigators interpreted the repeated prayer as the final words of a man who had decided to take his own life and the lives of everyone aboard. Egyptian officials argued passionately that this interpretation misunderstood their culture. The phrase they insisted was a common, everyday expression, something an Egyptian might say when facing any difficulty. It would never be used, they claim, by someone about to commit a sin as grave as mass murder. Aviation journalist William Langewiesche spent 3 weeks in Cairo investigating the crash for the Atlantic Monthly. He later won a National Magazine Award for his reporting. What he found was a society deeply divided between those who publicly supported the official Egyptian position and those who privately suspected the truth. Langewiesche wrote that ordinary Egyptians on the street believed in an American conspiracy, convinced that some external force had attacked Flight 990 and that the Americans were covering it up. But a smaller group, mostly educated professionals, knew perfectly well that Al-Battuti had crashed the plane on purpose. They saw the Egyptian government's position as typical stonewalling, an exercise in protecting national honor at the expense of truth. In February of 2000, a dramatic development seemed to support the NTSB's theory. An EgyptAir captain named Hamdi Hanafi Taha sought political asylum in Britain after landing his aircraft in London. Taha claimed to have knowledge of the circumstances behind the crash. According to Taha, Al-Battuti had been confronted by senior EgyptAir officials in New York shortly before Flight 990's departure. The relief first officer had been the subject of numerous complaints for inappropriate behavior with women at the Hotel Pennsylvania, a New York hotel frequently used by EgyptAir crews. The complaints allegedly included unwanted solicitations and other misconduct. Haytham Rushdie, EgyptAir's chief 767 pilot who died on Flight 990, had reportedly confronted Al-Battuti about the complaints. Taha claimed that Rushdie told Al-Battuti his flying privileges to the United States would be revoked and that Flight 990 would be his last trip on the route. If true, this provided a possible motive. Al-Battuti, facing professional humiliation and disgrace just months before his retirement, may have snapped. The Egyptian government dismissed Taha's claims. An advisor to President Hosni Mubarak said the defecting pilot could not possibly know anything relevant about the crash. EgyptAir officials rejected the allegations. Taha's application for asylum was ultimately denied, and he was reportedly of little use to investigators. But American officials later confirmed key aspects of Taha's story. FBI agents had interviewed staff at hotels where Al-Battuti stayed during New York layovers. They found evidence that he had been reprimanded for inappropriate behavior with female employees and guests. The Battuti family was enraged by the allegations. They insisted their relative was a good man, a devoted husband and father who had no reason to kill himself or anyone else. They pointed to the car tire he had purchased for his son, the plans he had made for retirement. This was not a man preparing to die, they argued. The NTSB's final report was issued on March 21, 2002, more than 2 years after the crash. The conclusion was carefully worded but unmistakable. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the EgyptAir Flight 990 accident is the airplane's departure from normal cruise flight and subsequent impact with the Atlantic Ocean as a result of the Relief First Officer's flight control inputs. The reason for the Relief First Officer's actions was not determined. The NTSB stopped short of using the word suicide or deliberate. It found that al-Battuti's control inputs caused the crash, but did not officially determine his motivation. This diplomatic language was intended to preserve relations with Egypt while still presenting the factual conclusions of the investigation. The report found that no mechanical failure scenario proposed by the Egyptian investigators matched the evidence from the flight recorders. Even if some mechanical failure had occurred, the 767's redundant elevator control system would have allowed the aircraft to be recovered. The NTSB tested every failure mode the Egyptians suggested and found that none could explain the flight data. Bernard Loeb, the NTSB's Director of Aviation Safety, was blunt in his assessment. He said that what was unprofessional was the insistence by the Egyptians, in the face of irrefutable evidence, that the airplane had not been intentionally flown into the ocean. The Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority issued its own report, reaching the opposite conclusion. The ECAA found that the crash was caused by mechanical failure of the aircraft's elevator control system, possibly involving a malfunction in one of the power control units. The Egyptian report argued that the NTSB had used selected facts and speculative conclusions to support a predetermined theory. It emphasized that American investigators had never identified a motive for al-Battuti's alleged actions, and it cited cultural evidence that the phrase "tawakkalt ala Allah" would never be used by someone about to commit an evil deed. To this day, the Egyptian government has never accepted the NTSB's findings. The dispute over Flight 990 became a diplomatic irritant between two nations that were otherwise close allies. American officials, mindful of Egypt's importance in Middle East diplomacy and the fight against terrorism, were reluctant to press the matter further. The families of the victims were caught in the middle. 1 year after the crash, on October 31st, 2,000 more than 500 relatives gathered at Brenton Point State Park in Newport, Rhode Island. The park overlooks the Atlantic Ocean, facing toward the waters where their loved ones had perished. A granite memorial had been erected there, roughly hewn on 3 of its 4 sides, to symbolize the family's pain and their difficult journey. An inscription in gold lettering on black stone reads, "In loving memory of the 217 family members and friends lost on EgyptAir Flight 990. May God's eternal light shine upon them." The final phrase, "They are not gone from us," appears in English, French, and Arabic. Before the monument, 217 bricks are set into the ground, each etched with the name of someone who died that night. Visitors can walk among them, reading the names, trying to imagine the lives cut short. Tom Brokaw, the NBC news anchor, spoke at the memorial service. "The ocean of darkness that engulfed us 1 year ago today will never ebb from our lives," he said. But from that ocean of darkness had arisen an island of peace in a chaotic and hostile world that bound the families together. James Hall, chairman of the NTSB, expressed his condolences. "We cannot begin to comprehend the full impact of this horrible tragedy on your lives," he told the mourners. The Rhode Island Medical Examiner reported that of the 217 victims, only 128 had been positively identified from the thousands of tissue fragments recovered from the ocean. The remains that were too small to identify were buried in the Island Cemetery in Newport, marked by a tombstone inscribed with words from the poet Khalil Gibran. "And ever had it been that love knows not its own depth until the hour of separation." Some families found closure. Others found only more questions. Jeff Kowalski of Detroit lost both his parents on Flight 990. "The service will be very emotional," he said, "but it's something you have to go through." Carol Seidman, who lost her mother Toby and 3 of her mother's closest friends, visited the memorial and saw al-Battuti's name inscribed among the victims. Her reaction was visceral. "I spat on it," she said. Freeman, the daughter of Sheila Jaffe, learned of her mother's death while staying at a New York hotel during a college visit with her daughter. She woke early, turned on CNN, and heard a mention of EgyptAir Flight 990. It was at the end of some story, she recalled, and the guy said, "And we'll get back to the disappearance of EgyptAir 990. And I was thinking it can't be, but it was. The crash of EgyptAir Flight 990 left a legacy of grief, controversy, and unanswered questions. For the families of the victims, there would never be a satisfactory explanation. Either their loved ones had been killed by a suicidal pilot, or they had died in a mechanical failure that the world's most sophisticated aviation investigators somehow missed. Neither answer provided comfort. The aviation industry did take some lessons from the disaster. NTSB Chairman James Hall recommended that video recorders be installed in aircraft cockpits, arguing that images might have resolved the questions that the audio and flight data could not. The FAA never implemented this recommendation, citing concerns about pilot privacy and union opposition. The crash also highlighted the vulnerability of aircraft to rogue crew members. In the years since Flight 990, there have been other suspected cases of pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft. EgyptAir's disaster occurred just 2 years after EgyptAir Flight 185 went down under similar circumstances in Indonesia. In 2015, a Germanwings first officer flew his Airbus A320 into the French Alps, killing 150 people. After the Germanwings disaster, new regulations required 2 crew members in the cockpit at all times. But such rules only work if the people in the cockpit are willing to stop someone intent on destruction. The Boeing 767 that crashed as Flight 990 was named after Thutmose III, one of the greatest warrior pharaohs of ancient Egypt. In his time, Thutmose conquered vast territories and built monuments that still stand thousands of years later. The aircraft that bore his name lies scattered across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, recovered piece by piece and stored in a hangar at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The investigation files run to thousands of pages. The debates continue. What drove Gamil al-Batouti to do what investigators believe he did? Was it the humiliation of disciplinary action just months before retirement? Was it something else entirely? Or did the NTSB get it wrong, and did some undiscovered mechanical failure bring down the aircraft? The official American investigation found that al-Batouti's control inputs caused the crash. The reason for those inputs was not determined. Perhaps that is the most honest conclusion possible. Perhaps we can know what happened without ever truly knowing why. What we do know is this: on a clear Halloween night in 1999, 217 people trusted their lives to an aircraft and a crew. They had every reason to believe they would land safely in Cairo. Instead, they became victims of one of aviation's most disturbing mysteries. At Brenton Point State Park, the memorial looks out over the ocean where they died. On calm days, the waves lap gently against the rocks below. On stormy days, the Atlantic roars with fury. Either way, the monument stands. The names endure, and the families remember. Sheila Jaffe, Toby Seidman, Beverly Grant, Judy Bowman, 4 friends who loved to travel together. Luc Dacey, who never got to celebrate his birthday among the pyramids. Claude Masson and Janine Bourdager leaving behind notes that simply said thank you. Adel Anwar, the young first officer who would never make it home for his wedding. Captain Ahmed El Habashi, the veteran who fought to save his aircraft until the very end. 217 souls gone in an instant. May God's eternal light shine upon them. They are not gone from us.